Welcome to Faith and Sustainability, a podcast where we look deeper into how our faith traditions inspired us to care for our common home. I'm Leonard Robinson, your host.
And I'm Kat Doyle, your co-host. Want to remind everybody that our podcast is made possible from the generous support of Jamie Lanier, the Varlamov Family Foundation, Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, St. Francis Services, and Semco Atlanta. So, Leonard, who's with us today?
We've got Drew Reynolds from Encounter, Georgia. Drew, welcome to the Faith and Sustainability Podcast.
It's just wonderful to be here. Thanks so much.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little about Encounter, Georgia?
So I'm cradle Catholic, went to Catholic school, and been Catholic my whole life. And recently, in the last couple of years, got involved with this organization, Encounter, Georgia, which I helped co-found. And really, this organization came together from an ask from the Catholic Climate Covenant, who was looking for people in different states across the country to come together and do some advocacy work over what eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act. And at that time, I was on a listserv, and they said, hey, we need some folks in Georgia. And a couple of us raised our hands and got together and started to host what we called encounter calls, which was ways to allow Catholics in the pews to have conversations with their elected officials and legislators. And so we had conversations with the offices of Senator Warnock and Ossoff, and then ultimately, which led to that advocacy work across the country, not just in Georgia, led to the passage of the IRA. And so after we did that, we were like, hey, that was kind of fun. Maybe we can keep doing this work. And so we founded Encounter Georgia to continue the work of creating opportunities of encounter between people in the pews, so to speak, and their legislative officials around issues of climate and environmental protection.
So what I'm hearing you say, if I'm not mistaken, is no good deed goes unpunished. You were asked, you raised your hand, and here you are. So as we're looking at all of this, did you bring specific advocacy background work to this, or is it just something that you felt a passion for? You know,
I think advocacy is something that we sometimes think is something only professionals can do or people who know what they're doing can do. And I'll be honest, I had a little bit of experience. Like I have, joined some, I've gone to the Capitol before to advocate on different issues on things, but I've never been a professional advocate or anything like that, or in engaging in the advocacy realm. I was just really interested in getting involved and having our voices heard on issues of the environment. And I found that for me, it was a really fulfilling way for me to manage some of my own, anxiety and fear over what's coming with the climate crisis, to be able to feel like you can do something and take action, and to be with other committed Catholics who have those same concerns and want to also take action. So I don't have a formal advocacy background, but I think like most things, if you're passionate enough about it, you can learn along the way.
So this is something anybody can do and everybody should do. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we try to accomplish at Encounter Georgia, there are a lot of different environmental groups out there. So like, why form another one, you might ask? Well, I think what we need is, for at least here in Georgia, opportunities for Catholics to get together with themselves and have an opportunity to do some advocacy as Catholics. And why that's so important is because we have so many groups out there, but maybe people might say, hey, that's another environmental group, or I don't know anybody there, or maybe that's something that's different. That's not me. But if we have opportunities to have dialogue with Catholics in the pews to say, hey, part of what it means to be Catholic is to care for creation. In fact, our Pope gave a really great encyclical on this called Laudato Si. And so we know this is central to who we are as Catholics. And maybe it isn't so weird to get together with somebody else at your church and say, hey, let's go have a conversation with our state senator about a particular issue of environmental concern in our community. That can be an active and normal expression of what it means to be Catholic. And I think that's one of our sort of understated goals of Encounter Georgia.
We're getting a change in administration. We're in year 2 of the Inflation Reduction Act, which you brought up. So what are some of the hot ticket items or things that we should know about and that you're working on?
Well, when it comes to advocacy work, it's always important to recognize there's so much to do on so many different levels. And I'll talk a little bit about maybe some like legislative priorities and policy proposals that we're looking at too. But I think advocacy actually goes even broader than that. It's not just having a conversation with an elected official, but can be something as simple as working in your garden in your backyard. But in any case, a couple of campaign areas that we're focused on. The biggest one that historically, we started doing the work with the Inflation Reduction Act, and we did that in communication with the Catholic Climate Covenant, had multiple encounters with some of our state senators here and ultimately saw that get passed, which was awesome. We've also done some advocacy work on a bill called the Forest Act, and we're still kind of seeing how that's going to come through, maybe what the right legislative vehicle might be for that. And in the near term, it might be difficult with our current federal landscape. But the purpose of that act would be to protect against deforestation around the world. And the reason we've started doing some advocacy around that issue is because the Sisters of Mercy and their advocacy have taken the lead on that one. And so we wanted to kind of support their work and see how we can engage folks in Georgia around that particular issue. But I would say the cornerstone of what we've been working on this year, and certainly in the next couple of months during the Legislative Assembly for the Georgia Assembly here in Georgia, is we're going to focus on protection for the Okefenokee Swamp. And for those of the listeners who may not know, the Okefenokee is a beautiful refuge, a beautiful swamp in South Georgia that is one of our most amazing natural resources in the state. It's a place that is home to all kinds of wildlife, beautiful birds, the Atlantic sturgeon, which is an endangered species, all kinds of different animals and wildlife. And is really a place of such incredible importance, particularly to folks in South Georgia. And so the reason that needs protection is that it's not, as some people might think, because you've heard about the Okefenokee probably before, it's not like a national park or some of the other places that receive some of those types of protections. And certainly there's an area along the edge of it called Trail Ridge that doesn't have that type of protection. And currently there is an organization, Twin Pines, that is seeking to put a mine on Trail Ridge. And some hydrologists and scientists and experts are concerned that mining along Trail Ridge might compromise the water levels in the swamp and ultimately lead to real problems, environmental problems in the swamp. And so our work at Encounter Georgia is to figure out how can we put together some protections that might be able to help preserve the swamp for future generations so that they might go and enjoy the wildlife so that the ecosystem that it has and all around it is protected, that it's a great climate issue too, because there's so much actual peat in the bottom of the swamp that if it gets released through wildfires and other types of environmental problems, it would be a real challenge from a climate perspective.
In listening to all this, my mind's kind of going crazy because, first of all, I'm hearing you're talking about something in South Georgia and we're in North Georgia. So, how is that really something we're supposed to be focused on? Then you're talking about mining and deforestation and water and all this. And I think for some people, it gets super confusing about why we are doing advocacy. And like you said, in all these different ways and in all these different places. Can you boil it down to why we're doing it?
The reason we focus on the Okefenokee is because of the way that it's a key issue to protect the environment, to protect against climate change, and to protect our habitats, right? And for us, I think as an organization, we want to focus on issues that resonate with a lot of Catholics. Many people in Georgia have visited the Okefenokee, have histories of going down and visiting with their families, and they have that experience of enjoying wildlife with their family. And we want them to be able to remember that and say, hey, isn't this something that you want to protect? And even for those of you who haven't been to the Okefenokee, maybe you've had an experience of going to North Georgia into the mountains or going out to maybe a national park somewhere. And those experiences, we try to reach people where they are and say, hey, this affects you because these are the places that we all want to visit as Georgians, as Americans, and have these places that are preserved for us and now and into the future. And I think that, when we focus on issues, we really want to pick those issues that I think resonate with our community. And what's really interesting about Okefenokee protection in Georgia is that it has one of the most bipartisan, or has the most bipartisan support really of almost any bill that went through the Georgia Assembly last year. So we are excited that this is a bill that really reaches people regardless of where they sit politically, but recognizing that protecting the environment is something that we all care about as Georgians.
So you've talked about politics. You've used the word bipartisan and politics and all of talking with your legislators. What part does our Catholic faith call us to be involved in politics? And I'm using air quotes when I say that.
Without the separation.
Right.
The way I try to think about this is I like to say, look, we are called as Catholics to be engaged in politics. In our work as a church, we need to be nonpartisan. And there's a difference there, right? So how can we find ways to engage people on issues that we know are central to our Catholic faith, but that go beyond partisan boundaries? When we talk about environmental issues in Georgia, it's also important to think about what's local and what matters in your community. When I go up north and talk to folks from up north, it's about protecting forests and it's about protecting bears. When you talk to people in Atlanta, it's about affordable housing. in transportation and energy burden. When you talk to people in coastal Georgia, it's about protecting beaches and coastlands. And in South Georgia, it's the Okefenokee and beyond. And so what I think we have to do as Catholics is get beyond these partisan binaries that can be so alienating and so hard and frustrating for so much of us to wrap our heads around, and just say, hey, I care about the environment. And our Catholic Church is big enough for people to care about more than one environmental issue and have more than one policy response to that policy issue.
Absolutely.
And so I think when it comes to people thinking about, hey, how can I get involved and do this in my community, whether you think your community is this label or that label, you can still do it. It's not something that we can't do.
Drew, how do you prioritize what issues you're going to advocate and which ones you're not?
Well, it's not an easy one to do. And I would be wrong to say that we have it perfect, by any means. But what I would say is for Catholics who want to do environmental advocacy in Catholic spaces, a couple of recommendations I would have is to begin first with, what is your community seeing? When we have advocacy workshops that we've developed that we try to implement in different parishes, and if parishes are out there across Georgia want to do that, contact me and we'll find a way to make it happen. But we use a model called See, Judge, Act, which comes out of our Catholic social teaching tradition, which says, hey, let's see and listen. What is it that our community is telling us are challenges right now? There are people in the Atlanta region who are really concerned about the biolab fire and the smoke that came that caused challenges to air pollution, right? Is that an issue that your particular community is really concerned about, or is it something else? And then when you find what your community is really interested in, you work to build consensus. Do we have a core group, a majority of people who really want to see this issue through and to talk about this issue? And then you figure out, okay, so then how can we then take that conversation to our elected officials who might be able to help us to resolve that challenge or difficulty or problem? And so I don't think that there's a criteria as far as this type of issue or that type of issue. It begins with listening and engagement in your parish and taking the time to listen and talk to people, maybe people who you think you disagree with a lot on. And maybe you'll be surprised that you find that you actually have some more common ground than you thought when you have that dialogue. But it takes that listening and engagement. And that's where I think all decisions on which policies to prioritize begin.
Okay, I have found that, environmental issues their environment is nonpartisan, but how we get to a certain spot, that's where the partisanship comes in. So you make a very, very good point. Here's a question. It's a two-part question. What led you to advocacy? And then when did you arrive at the corner of faith and sustainability? When did your faith take over, or has that always been there for you in advocacy work and what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. The first one you asked was, how did you turn to advocacy? And I would say that when I first started I had a kind of a bit of a conversion experience myself about a decade ago. And I just read and watched everything that I could about the climate crisis. And that conversion was happening to me for really two reasons. One, I started to realize this isn't something like when I learned as a kid in school, that this is not something in the future. This is happening right now. And two, I was also going to be having my own kids and they were going to have a future. And I was concerned for what they were going to experience. And then lastly, I was concerned about my own complicity in it, because we're all using carbon. We're all contributing in some way to some of the things that are bringing some challenge and difficulty to our environment. And so when I realized that this was not something I could tackle my own, this was not something I was going to be able to fix by just simply changing something in my lifestyle, even though you should do those things. But to do the type of work that is needed to address the climate crisis, we have to think big and work big. And so that means that we have to do some more work on advocacy. And that's why that's kind of what led me into this work now. It wouldn't be enough for me to just start composting in my house, which I do, and it's awesome. But
Yay!
To also think about, hey, how can we think about composting in a parish, in a county, in a state, thinking about it on bigger levels so that we can have the type of impact we know is needed. But then to your other question, Leonard, about how this intersects with faith. I'm lucky that I am married to a theologian, Dr. Susan Reynolds, who's a professor of Catholic studies at Emory University. Google her. She does all kinds of amazing theological work. And as I was going through this own conversion of my own and frustration too, and fear almost at seeing an impending climate crisis and what to do about it, she says, our Pope wrote something about that. You should read it. And then she handed me Laudato Si. And when I read Laudato Si, it was just a just a worldview changing experience for me that gave me the language that I was looking for to express my concern about what was going on out there, to help me understand that through the Catholic lens, which I grew up with and love and cherish so dearly, but also give me practical steps of what to do about it. And it led me on this road of advocacy.
So it's interesting. First of all, great shout out to Dr. Susan there. So, but the other thing that you were talking about is you have to think big and go big. But wait a minute, back at the beginning of this podcast, you said something about gardening in the backyard as advocacy. That's different than going great big. So what did you mean by that?
Well, I think that you can do two things at once, right? One of my favorite things to do in the spring is to get together with my 6-year-old and talk about how we're going to plant this year's crops at our backyard. And we have a couple of small beds. It's not a lot, but it's wonderful. And to watch as they look through the different types of flowers we might plant, or to figure out what brand of tomatoes we're going to do, is so exciting. And that then leads to opportunities to say, hey, what can we do to make sure that our soil that we plant this in is going to be healthy soil, so that when you eat it, it's still healthy? And also not just this soil, but what about the soil in other parts of Georgia where we know we have issues with soil amendments that are putting pollutants into the ground where we plant our crops? And when we make that connection between what we do at home, what we eat at home, how we dispose of waste at home, how we reduce energy use at home, to also those same things happening at a broader level, then it carries meaning. I actually think it's really difficult to do environmental advocacy work and not engage in personal change of some kind of your own, because it doesn't make sense. There's an inconsistency there. But at the same time, if we're going to walk outside and care so much for creation and go on these walks and love our environment, how can we not take action on a broader level to make sure that we're doing the things at the more systemic levels that we know are needed to protect the environment? So I think the two just have to go hand in hand. And if you don't feel comfortable doing the big stuff yet, if you feel like it would be too intimidating to call a legislator, you don't have to do that tomorrow. You can start by just going to your care and creation team meeting at your local parish. And then maybe down the line, you'll feel a little bit more comfortable to call up a senator.
What kind of reaction do you get when you tell people that Encounter Georgia is a Catholic organization?
Oh, it's awesome. It's great. Because I think that sometimes there's this idea of like, oh, do Catholics do that? Is this something that Catholics care about? And I love when we get to have that as a conversation, because Encounter Georgia, we're certainly about engaging, people with as I said, like people in the pews and elected officials having conversations together. But I think broadly, what I hope Encounter Georgia is able to accomplish is help us to redefine a little bit about what it means to be a Catholic in the public sphere. And that goes beyond just environmental issues. It can go on to many other issues, that Catholics in the United States have a duty and obligation to engage in the public sphere as democratic citizens, and that we have to bring that voice in our faith tradition and our Catholic social teaching to that conversation to help advocate for the things that we hold so dear. And I hope that it goes bigger than, I hope that vision comes through. But that when people find out, hey, Encounter Georgia is Catholic, I actually find people are pretty excited about it. And for those who are Catholic and some who are not, actually, who are still like, hey, can I still help or support you guys or be connected even if I'm not Catholic? We say, yeah, sure. Come on down.
It's interesting. You've taken this concept of this intricate web that everything kind of intersects, and maybe given the concept of seamless garment a different context in which we might use it. But as we wrap up this podcast today, maybe you could share with our listeners just one thing that you do that you think other people might be able to do as well. One small thing or big thing, but one thing that you do that others might be able to do as well.
Read. And I know that maybe that's actually, read as much as you can, because what I have found is that educating myself on these issues is the catalyst that kind of gets me inspired to take action. And it helps me to understand, sometimes environmental stuff can be really complicated. It's like, how do I know this is affecting that? And how do I understand these issues? Reading Laudato Si, and then reading other great books about the environment. I love following the work of David Wallace Wells and Elizabeth Colbert. Those are two great authors that I would recommend. But there's so many others too that you can find that may be accessible to you to lead about the environment. And I would say the second thing too is I've had a particular devotion to St. Francis of late. And for those of you who maybe know a little bit about St. Francis, but maybe don't know a lot, find a biography of St. Francis. That's a great place to begin too.
So read, Leonard. That's all we have to do.
There you
Who
go.
knew?
Let me put that on my Kindle and have it read to me.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Drew, for taking the time to be with us and educating us a little bit and reminding us that really to get started in advocacy, one of the coolest things we can do is just do a little reading.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Drew.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate the invitation.
We want you to reach out to us and share your journey with the hashtag faith and sustainability.
And by all means, do not forget to like and subscribe to the podcast so you'll always know when our next episode is and what's coming down the pike. And Leonard, we'll look forward to meeting you next time
at the intersection of faith and sustainability.
The preceding podcast is a production of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta. Copyright 2025.